The morning I found the silver ring, I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't call my sister. I didn't sit on the kitchen floor and cry the way women do in movies when their world falls apart. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up 4 years of bank statements. Because here's what you need to understand about me. My name is Dorothy Washington, and I spent 30 years as a senior auditor. I don't process pain the way most people do. I process data. And when something doesn't add up, when a number is wrong, when a pattern breaks, when a line item appears where it shouldn't, I don't panic. I investigate. The ring was silver. Simple band, maybe a size 10. I found it in the breast pocket of Gerald's gray wool vest, the one he'd left on the back of the bedroom chair, the one I was taking to the dry cleaner on a Tuesday morning in June of 2024. I almost missed it. My fingers closed around it by accident, the way you find a forgotten dollar in a winter coat. I held it up to the light from the window, engraved on the inside in small clean letters, G and B, forever, June 2021. I read it once. I read it twice. I turned it over in my fingers the way I used to turn over a financial document that didn't make sense, slowly, methodically, waiting for the information to arrange itself into something I could work with. G and B, Gerald, and someone whose name started with B, since June 2021. 3 years, while I had been here, in this house, cooking Sunday dinners and planning our retirement and believing, genuinely believing, that we were moving towards something good. I set the ring on this table beside my laptop. I looked at it for exactly 10 seconds. Then I opened the joint checking account and started reading. What I found in the next 72 hours would have broken a different woman. There was $340,000 missing, not all at once, not in any way that would have triggered a flag if you weren't looking carefully. Small withdrawals, reclassified expenses, transfers to a business account I hadn't reviewed in over a year because Gerald had said, You retired. Let me handle the business side now. You've done enough. And I had believed him. That was the part that sat in my chest like a stone. I had believed him. But here is what Gerald Washington forgot, in all his careful planning, in all his quiet rearranging of our financial life. I never stopped keeping records. 30 years of auditing teaches you one thing above everything else. Paper doesn't lie. Numbers don't lie. And a woman who has kept every bank statement, every contract, every receipt since 1992 in a fireproof filing cabinet in her home office, that woman is not someone you want to steal from. They thought I would be the grieving wife. They thought I would cry and sign whatever was put in front of me, just to make the pain stop. They didn't know that I had already started counting, and I had counted every single penny. I want to tell you where I came from, because it matters. It matters to understand why I am the way I am, and why what happened hit me the way it did. Not like a wave that knocks you down, but like an audit finding that makes everything suddenly, terribly clear. I grew up in Baltimore. Waverly neighborhood, the East Side, in a narrow row house with green shutters that my mother repainted every spring whether they needed it or not. My father, Charles Edward Patterson, was an electrician for the city. My mother, Ruth, was a registered nurse at Johns Hopkins for 31 years. They were not wealthy people, but they were precise people. My mother kept a household ledger, an actual paper ledger, the kind with the green columns, and every Friday evening after dinner, she would sit at the kitchen table and reconcile the week's spending to the penny. I used to sit beside her and watch. I was maybe 8 years old. I thought it was the most serious and important thing I had ever seen a person do. Dorothy, she told me once, not looking up from her columns, a woman who knows her numbers cannot be surprised, and a woman who cannot be surprised cannot be robbed. I wrote that down in my school notebook the next day. I was 8 years old, and I already understood that she was telling me something essential. I won a full scholarship to Howard University in 1983, accounting major. I was the first person in my family to go to a 4-year college, and I treated that opportunity with the gravity it deserved. I graduated third in my class in 1987. By 1990, I was a senior associate at a mid-size accounting firm in Atlanta. By 1995, I was a senior auditor. By 2002, I was directing a team of 11 people and managing audits for clients with revenues in the hundreds of millions. Before I married Gerald Washington, I had saved $280,000. I want you to understand that number. I was a black woman in America in the late 1980s and 1990s. And I had saved $280,000 through discipline and sacrifice, and the complete refusal to spend money on anything that wasn't building my future. I didn't take lavish vacations. I drove the same Honda Accord for 9 years. I brought my lunch to work every single day for a decade. $280,000. Mine. Every dollar. I met Gerald in the spring of 1992 at a mutual friend's dinner party on the southwest side of Atlanta. He was 30 years old, tall, wearing a blue blazer that he'd clearly pressed himself because there was a faint line on the sleeve where the iron had gotten too hot. He was funny and warm, and he had this way of listening to you. Really listening, leaning forward slightly, as if what you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. He was a junior architect at a firm downtown. Talented, everyone said so, but he was also disorganized with money in the way that some creative people are. Not irresponsible exactly, just uninterested in the mechanics of it. He had a savings account with $4,200 in it when we started dating. He had $11,000 in credit card debt. He had a beautiful portfolio of design work and absolutely no idea how to turn that talent into lasting financial security. I was not naive about this. I saw it clearly. But I also saw a man who was kind, who was genuinely good, who made me feel seen in a way that I hadn't felt before. And I genuinely thought, that what I had to offer and what he had to offer would make something stronger together than either of us could build alone. I paid off his credit card debt before we got married. He didn't ask me to. I did it because I couldn't start a financial partnership with that weight already on the balance sheet. We sat down at my kitchen table, my apartment, my table, and I laid out a plan. I showed him how we would live, how we would save, how we would invest. He looked at the spreadsheet I'd made and said, "Dot, I am going to spend the rest of my life being grateful I married an accountant." We laughed. I remember the way the light came through the window that afternoon. We bought our first house in 1995, a 3-bedroom on the northeast side of Atlanta, modest but solid. The down payment was $60,000. I paid it from my personal savings. Gerald's name went on the deed alongside mine, because that is what you do when you love someone and you believe in the life you're building together. You don't protect yourself from the person you love. You invest in them. In 1998, Gerald came home one evening with a folder of business plans and a look on his face that I recognized. The look of a man who had made up his mind about something and was hoping his wife would agree. "I want to start my own firm," he said. I looked at the plans. They were good. His vision was clear, his potential client list was solid, his design philosophy was distinctive. What was missing was everything else: the financial structure, the operational plan, the risk analysis, the cash flow projections. "Give me the weekend," I said. I spent that weekend building the business plan that became Washington Architecture Group. I structured it. I projected it. I identified the risks and mitigation strategies. I set up the accounting system. And for the first 7 years, 1998 to 2005, I worked as the firm's chief financial officer alongside my full-time auditing job. I didn't take a salary from the firm. We agreed that in the early years, every dollar needed to go back into the business. By 2005, Washington Architecture Group had 5 full-time employees, 14 ongoing client contracts, and annual revenue of $890,000. I left my firm in 2010 at Gerald's request. "Dot, the business is stable now. You've been working 2 jobs for 12 years. Let me take care of things. You've earned the rest." I was 44 years old and I had spent 23 years building not just my own career, but his. I agreed to step back. I focused on managing our personal finances, our investment portfolio, our retirement accounts. I was still working, just differently. By 2024, here is what we had built together. Our home in Buckhead, Atlanta, $1.1 million. Washington Architecture Group, valued at a conservative $2.3 million. Our joint retirement accounts, $890,000. Investment portfolio, $450,000. Total marital assets, approximately $4.74 million. I had watched every dollar of that grow from the first seed I planted in 1995. And then there was my mother's legacy. Ruth Patterson died in March of 2018, 2 months after her 80th birthday. She left behind $175,000 in savings and a row house in Waverly, the house with the green shutters, appraised at $220,000. Her will was specific and deliberate, written in the careful language of a woman who had spent her life being precise. The assets were to pass to her daughter Dorothy Washington as sole and separate property, not subject to any marital claim. My mother had never said a negative word about Gerald in 26 years of knowing him, but she had written that clause into her will anyway, because she was Ruth Patterson, and Ruth Patterson knew her numbers, and Ruth Patterson did not leave things to chance. I grieved her for a long time, and then in early 2019, Gerald sat down across from me at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one I'd chosen, the one where my mother had once sat and drunk coffee and talked about her garden, and he suggested that we consolidate. It would just be simpler, for tax purposes, for estate planning. If everything is in the joint accounts, it's cleaner, easier for the kids eventually. I thought about it. I talked to a financial advisor, not a lawyer, a mistake I will carry with me. The advisor said it made sense from an estate efficiency standpoint. I transferred my mother's house and her savings into our joint holdings in the spring of 2019. That was the only decision I ever made purely on trust, without doing my own full analysis first. It was the only one I would come to regret. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not see it coming. I know that might be hard to believe. A woman with my background, my training, my instincts. But I trusted Gerald in the way that you trust the foundation of a house. You don't check it every day. You assume it's there. You build your life on top of it. That's the particular cruelty of a long betrayal. It doesn't ask you to look away. It just waits patiently while you look at everything else. I need to tell you exactly what happened. Not in the blurry, emotional way that we sometimes tell these stories. Exactly, because the details matter, and because the truth deserves to be told with the same precision with which it was hidden. March 2020, the pandemic. Gerald started working from home, which I had thought would bring us closer together. Those long evenings, the quiet of the house, the sense that the whole world had slowed down and we had time, finally, to just be with each other. Instead, Gerald worked. Long hours, video calls, his home office door closed until 9 or 10 at night. I understood. The architecture industry was in turmoil. He was managing client anxieties, renegotiating contracts, keeping staff employed when projects were freezing. I gave him the space he needed. I was proud of him, actually, the way he held the firm together during that first brutal year. There were calls at odd hours. He explained them as clients in different time zones, international partnerships he was developing. I didn't question it. I was in my 60s, and I knew what it was to work hard and not want to be interrupted. August 2021. Gerald introduced me to Brendan Holloway at a firm dinner, a small gathering at a restaurant in Midtown, 6 people around a table, good wine, and talk about a major contract they'd just landed. Brendan was 38, compact and neat, with careful eyes and a practiced smile. He shook my hand firmly and said it was wonderful to finally meet me. He'd heard so much about me. Gerald spoke about me all the time. I noticed that he didn't quite meet my eyes when he said it. I filed that away without naming it, the way you set aside a figure that doesn't quite balance and intend to come back to it. Gerald called him a rising talent. Said bringing Brendan on as a design partner was one of the best decisions he'd made in years. I had no reason to think anything else. January 2022. I was reviewing some household expenses. I still managed our personal accounts, still reconciled everything monthly, old habit, couldn't stop even in retirement. And I came across a line item on a secondary credit card that I didn't recognize. The Four Seasons in Savannah. 4 nights, $8,400. I asked Gerald about it over breakfast. Team retreat, he said, not looking up from his phone. Strategic planning. I mentioned it, I did not remember him mentioning it, but I had been dealing with a health issue that fall. Nothing serious, a knee surgery and 6 weeks of recovery, and I had been distracted. It was possible I'd forgotten. I let it go. I should not have let it go, but I did. The months continued. Small things, individually meaningless. Gerald coming home later than expected and explaining it in a way that was almost too smooth, too prepared. His phone, which had always lived on the kitchen counter, now living in his pocket or face down on his nightstand. A new cologne I didn't recognize, something darker and more expensive than what he usually wore. The particular flatness in his voice sometimes when I talked about our retirement plans, as if he were listening to a story that no longer quite applied to him. I noticed. I tucked each observation away. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that 32 years of marriage deserved more trust than this. I told myself that Gerald Washington was a good man. I was right about 32 years deserving trust. I was wrong about Gerald Washington. June 3rd, 2024. A Tuesday. I was collecting laundry, pulling Gerald's gray wool vest from the back of the bedroom chair where he'd left it after a client dinner the week before. I was going to drop it at the dry cleaner on my way to the pharmacy. My fingers found the ring in the breast pocket. I have already told you what I did next. What I have not told you is what I found. I spent 72 hours, 3 full days, going through every account, every statement, every record I had access to. I did not sleep. I ate crackers and drank coffee and sat at my desk the way I used to sit during a major audit, when the numbers were telling you something was wrong and you needed to find exactly where and exactly how. Here is what I found. Hotel stays and resort charges, $67,000 across 14 separate trips between 2021 and 2024. Four Seasons Savannah, Ritz-Carlton Amelia Island, a resort in the Bahamas for 5 nights in February 2023. All on the secondary business card, all categorized as client entertainment or professional development. Jewelry and personal gifts, $43,500. I cross-referenced the purchase dates with every piece of jewelry I owned. None of it had come to me. A bracelet from a jeweler in Buckhead, $6,800, purchased in September 2022. A watch from a boutique in New York, $12,000, purchased the weekend Gerald attended a conference I had not been invited to join. Transfers to a limited liability company, $180,000, moved in increments of $8,000 to $15,000 over 3 years, classified as subcontracting fees. The LLC was called Holloway Design Solutions. Brendan Holloway, sole owner. Business restructuring. Gerald had quietly brought Brendan in as a 15% equity partner in Washington Architecture Group in March 2023. My firm, our firm, the firm I had structured and projected and managed for the first 7 years of its existence. Without telling me, without asking me, I found the amended operating agreement in the business files Gerald kept on a shared drive I hadn't accessed in 2 years. The total, $340,500 that I could document. Possibly more that I hadn't found yet. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the numbers on my screen. I looked at them for a long time, and then I found the thing that changed everything. I found it because of an old habit. When something doesn't add up in one account, you check the adjacent ones. You look at what's nearby. I had been going through Gerald's personal files on the shared drive, things I'd had access to for years and never had reason to look at closely, when I found a folder labeled simply, Estate Planning 2023. Inside was a draft document from a law firm I didn't recognize. Dated November 2023, 7 months before I found the ring. It was a new will, Gerald's will, being prepared in secret, without my knowledge, without any conversation between us about updating our estate plans. I read it slowly, the way I had read the engraving on the ring, once, twice, a third time, waiting for the information to mean something different than it appeared to mean. It did not mean something different. Gerald's new will distributed his assets as follows: 40% to our son Deshaun, 20% to our daughter Imani, and 40% to Brendan James Holloway, business partner and life partner. My name was not in the document. Not once. In 32 years of marriage, in the house I had made a home, in the business I had helped build from nothing, in the life I had given the best of myself to, Gerald Washington had written me entirely out of his future. I closed the laptop. I sat in my home office in the dark for a long moment, in the chair I'd bought at an estate sale in 2009 because it had good lumbar support and I knew I'd be sitting in it for years. I looked at the fireproof filing cabinet against the wall, the one my mother had given me when I got my first professional job, the one that held 30 years of records in hanging folders organized by year and category. Then I did the thing that has always steadied me in every difficult moment of my professional life. I made a list. What I knew, what I could prove, what I needed, what I was going to do. I did not cry that night. I did not cry because crying would not recover $340,000. Crying would not undo a fraudulent will. Crying would not give me back the 7 years I had worked without pay, the $60,000 down payment, the career capital I had invested in a business that now had someone else's name attached to it as a partner. Crying would not help. But 30 years of meticulous record-keeping? That was going to help enormously. They thought I would be the woman who didn't look. They forgot I had been looking and writing it all down since the very beginning. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what I did next. I was not operating from rage. Rage is loud and imprecise, and it makes you move too fast. Rage is what they were counting on. The grief-stricken wife who confronts her husband in a burst of emotion, says things that can be used against her, makes decisions before she has the full picture. Rage hands your opponent the advantage. What I was operating from was something colder and more useful. It was the same thing I had operated from in 30 years of auditing when I found evidence of financial misconduct in a client's books. A quiet, focused determination to document everything, understand everything, and then move with precision. I gave myself 48 hours before I made a single call. I used those 48 hours to organize. I went through the fireproof cabinet, every folder, every year going back to 1992. I pulled every document that was relevant and made 2 copies of each. One set in a new folder, one set photographed and uploaded to a private cloud account Gerald had no access to, under an email address I had created on my phone using data, not our home Wi-Fi. Old auditor habits. You always have a backup. You always assume someone might try to take the original. By the end of those 48 hours, I had a clear picture of what I was working with, and I had decided on the first and most important step. I did not call the family attorney we'd used for 20 years. He was a good man, but he was Gerald's contact as much as mine, and I needed someone who belonged entirely to me. I asked Imani. My daughter is 32, practical, and sharp in the way that children of careful mothers sometimes are. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I told her only that I needed a referral for an estate and family law attorney, someone who was known for being thorough. She gave me a name without hesitation. Patricia Okafor, Imani said. She handled my friend Keisha's mother's case, the one where the husband had hidden accounts in 3 states. Patricia found all of them. I wrote the name down. Patricia Okafor's office was on Peachtree Road, 14th floor, with a view of the city that I later learned she had specifically chosen because she wanted her clients to feel, from the moment they walked in, that they were on higher ground. She was in her early 50s, Nigerian-American, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead until she needed them. She had the kind of stillness about her that I recognized. The stillness of someone who has learned that you get more information by listening than by talking. I came to our first meeting with the accordion folder, a legal pad, and the calm expression I had worn into difficult audit meetings for 3 decades. I laid everything out on her conference table in the order I had organized it. The bank statements with the irregular transfers highlighted in yellow, the hotel and gift receipts I had cross-referenced, the LLC registration for Holloway Design Solutions, the amended operating agreement adding Brendan as equity partner, and, last, placed in the center of the table like the final piece of evidence in a long investigation, the photographs I had taken of the draft will. Patricia did not speak for 22 minutes. She read. She made small notations on a yellow legal pad. She went back to certain pages, read them again. I sat across from her and waited, the way I had learned to wait in every professional setting, without fidgeting, without filling silence unnecessarily. Finally, she set down her pen and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. Mrs. Washington, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. That's the only way I answer questions, I said. How long have you been keeping records like this? Since 1992, I said. Every year, every account. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Do you know how rare that is? I know, I said. My mother taught me. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Washington, I've been doing this work for 23 years. I want to tell you what I see in these documents, because I think you need to hear it stated clearly before we discuss strategy. She ticked the points off on her fingers. The draft will had a procedural defect. It was missing a required witness signature to be valid under Georgia law. It was not yet enforceable. The $180,000 transferred to Holloway Design Solutions met the legal definition of fraudulent transfer of marital assets, particularly because the LLC's primary function appeared to be receiving funds rather than performing documented work. The addition of Brendan Holloway as a 15% equity partner in Washington Architecture Group, a marital asset, without my knowledge or consent was legally contestable as unauthorized disposition of jointly held property. And the original down payment of $60,000 I had made from personal savings in 1995, combined with my 7 years of documented CFO service, gave me a strong argument for enhanced equitable distribution, even beyond the standard 50-50 split Georgia courts typically applied. "They made mistakes," Patricia said, and there was something quiet and almost satisfied in her voice. "They made quite a few of them, possibly because they assumed you weren't watching." "Everyone makes that assumption," I said. "Their loss," said Patricia Okafor. "Now let me tell you what we're going to do." Patricia's first recommendation was a forensic accountant. She had someone specific in mind, a firm she used regularly, but when I mentioned Raymond Stokes, her eyebrows went up. "You know Raymond Stokes?" "We worked together at Deloitte for 6 years in the 90s, I said. "He's the best I've ever seen at reconstructing a financial trail." "Call him," Patricia said simply. Raymond had retired from firm work 5 years earlier and now took private forensic accounting cases selectively. When I called him, he answered on the second ring. I explained the situation in broad strokes: a marital asset dispute, potential fraudulent transfers, a business valuation I believed was being deliberately suppressed. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Dorothy Patterson," he says. He still used my maiden name, the way old colleagues sometimes do. "You think someone cooked the books on you?" "I think someone significantly undercooked them," I said. "Send me what you have." Raymond spent 10 days going through everything I sent him, plus additional records he subpoenaed through Patricia's office once we formally opened the case. He was methodical and thorough, and when he called me to go over his preliminary findings, his voice had the particular flat tone of a professional who is angry but disciplined about it. The transfers to Holloway Design Solutions totaled not $180,000 as I had initially calculated, but $203,000 once Raymond identified several that had been routed indirectly through a third account. The subcontracting invoices Brendan's LLC had submitted to justify the payments were, in Raymond's assessment, largely fabricated, work that had either not been performed or had been performed by Washington Architecture Group's own staff and double billed. The hotel stays and personal gifts came to $118,000 once Raymond completed the full accounting, significantly higher than my initial $67,000 estimate, because he found charges I hadn't identified, including a 5-day trip to a resort in Turks and Caicos in October 2022 that had been split across 3 different accounts to avoid any single large charge. And then there was the business valuation. Raymond said, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "Gerald hired a valuation firm in February of this year. They came back with $1.4 million. "That's wrong," I said immediately. "It's not just wrong," Raymond said. "It's specifically, strategically wrong. I've done my own analysis: revenue, client contracts, asset base, market comparables. Washington Architecture Group is worth between $2.6 and $3.1 million. The firm Gerald hired used a methodology that would only produce a $1.4 million figure if you made a series of very particular assumptions about depreciation and client retention that are not supported by the actual business data." I was quiet for a moment. "He was preparing for the divorce before I found the ring," I said. "Based on the timeline of the valuation engagement," Raymond said carefully, "he initiated that process approximately 5 months before June 2024. 5 months. While we had eaten dinner together, watched television together, talked about where we might travel when the weather cooled, Gerald had been quietly building a financial framework designed to minimize what I would receive when he left. I thanked Raymond and ended the call. Then I sat at my desk and thought about the woman my mother had raised me to be. The woman who knew her numbers, the woman who could not be surprised, the woman who could not be robbed. Almost, Mama, I thought. He almost managed it. Almost. The Baltimore house was the thing that made me feel sick in a way that the business numbers didn't. Because the business was money. Significant, important money, but money. The Baltimore house was my mother. It was the green shutters she repainted every spring. It was the kitchen table where she had taught me to keep a ledger. It was Ruth Patterson's life's work, left to her daughter as a deliberate and specific act of love. And Gerald had talked me into pooling it into our joint assets. I told Patricia the full story of the transfer. When it happened, what Gerald had said, the financial advisor I'd consulted. Patricia listened without expression. Then she asked for the original probate documents from my mother's estate. I had them. Of course I had them. 2018, Waverly Neighborhood, Baltimore, Ruth Patterson Estate. Hanging folder, probate section, filed alphabetically. Patricia read the language of the will carefully. Then she looked up. "Your mother's attorney wrote this well," she said. "The clause specifying sole and separate property is explicit. The question is whether the 2019 transfer overrides it." "Does it?" "Not necessarily," Patricia said. "When you transferred the asset into the joint account, there was no written agreement that you were changing its character from separate property to marital property. You moved the money, but you didn't sign a post-nuptial agreement reclassifying it. Under Georgia case law, there's a strong argument that the original intent of the bequest, your mother's documented intent, can be used to demonstrate that the asset retained its separate character." She paused. "It's not a certainty, but it's a real argument, especially combined with everything else we're bringing to this case. A judge looking at the full picture of Gerald's conduct is going to be less inclined to rule against you on a technicality involving your late mother's estate." I thought about my mother sitting at her kitchen table on Friday evenings, reconciling her columns to the penny. "Make the argument," I said. "I want to tell you about the afternoon I signed my new will, because it was one of the most deliberate and clear-headed moments of my life." Patricia had drafted it carefully. I had reviewed every line. Imani would receive 60% of my personal assets. She had stood beside me through all of this, quietly and without drama, asking only what I needed and then providing it. She had earned that. Deshawn would receive 30%, but contingent on signing an acknowledgement of the origins of the assets, a legal document confirming that the wealth had been built substantially through my contributions. Not to punish him, to create a record, for him and for any future dispute, of the truth. 10% to Howard University, for a scholarship fund for Black women studying accounting and finance. I had been thinking about that since the night I sat in my office in the dark and made my list. Some part of what I had built needed to go toward making sure other women had the tools I'd had. Gerald was not named. Additionally, I signed a durable power of attorney designating Imani as my agent for financial decisions. If anything happened to me before this was resolved, Gerald Washington would have no legal authority over a single dollar of my estate. When we finished, Patricia's assistant brought in 2 witnesses and a notary. I signed each page in my usual handwriting, the precise, even signature I had used on audit reports and financial documents for 30 years. Patricia walked me to the elevator afterward. "How are you doing?" she asked. It was the first personal question she had asked me in all our meetings. I considered it honestly. "I'm doing what needs to be done," I said. "I'll feel everything else later." She nodded as if this made complete sense to her. "Good strategy," she said. "This was the hardest part. I want you to understand how hard it was, because I don't want you to think I am a woman without feeling. I have feeling. I had 32 years of feeling invested in Gerald Washington, and the weight of what he had done sat on my chest every morning when I woke up. But I could not let him see it. Every evening for 6 weeks I made dinner. I asked about his day. I sat with him in the living room and watched the news and made the small, ordinary comments that constitute the texture of a long marriage. When he mentioned Brendan thinks we should pursue that healthcare complex contract. I said that sounded promising and asked how the design concept was developing. One Friday evening, Gerald brought Brendan to the house for dinner. He called it a working dinner. They needed to go over some contract documents. Would I mind? It would just be a few hours. I made shrimp and grits, my mother's recipe, the one I had made for every important dinner in this house for 25 years. I set the table properly, with the good placemats and the water glasses that caught the light. Brendan Holloway sat in my dining room and ate my mother's recipe and told me the food was incredible. He looked slightly uncomfortable throughout the evening, not enough that Gerald would notice, but enough that I did. He knew what he was. He knew what he had taken. And sitting in my house, eating my cooking, he knew that I did not know, and the knowledge of that, his false safety, was evident in the careful way he positioned himself in my presence. I smiled at him across the table and refilled his water glass. "I am counting every dollar you have taken from this house," I thought, while I smiled. "And every dollar is going to come back." Then, in the 5th week, something happened that I had not anticipated. My phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, a number I recognized. Carolyn Reese, Gerald's younger sister. We had always been cordial, Carolyn and I. She came to Christmas. She sent birthday cards. She was not a close friend, but she was a known presence in my life for 3 decades. Dot, she said, and her voice was tight in a way I had not heard from her before. I need to tell you something. I've been trying to decide whether to call for a long time, and I have to. I sat down. I've known about Gerald and Brendan since last year, Carolyn said. He told me. He made me promise to keep it between us. He said he was going to handle things and that it would all be sorted out and I should just stay out of it. She paused. I should have called you the moment he told me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dot. I was trying not to get in the middle of it and I chose wrong. I was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then I said with complete steadiness, Carolyn, thank you for calling. I appreciate you more than you know right now. Are you okay? I'm going to be, I said. And Carolyn, I may need you to have a conversation with my attorney at some point. Just a brief one. Would you be willing? A long pause. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I owe you that. I ended the call. I sat still for a moment. Then I called Patricia. We have a witness, I said, Gerald's own sister. She knew about the relationship for over a year and he specifically asked her to conceal it. Patricia was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. That, she said, is deliberate concealment of material information from a spouse. That is very useful, Dorothy. I smiled for the first time in 6 weeks. Not a performance smile, a real one. They made mistakes, Patricia had said at our first meeting. They had no idea how many. Week 7. The plan was moving. The forensic report was nearly complete. Patricia had filed preliminary paperwork. The Baltimore House petition had been submitted to the court as a separate proceeding. My new will was signed and stored. And then Deshawn called. My son is 29 years old. He has his father's height and his father's charm, and I had always hoped more of his mother's judgment. He called on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had a careful quality to it, the voice of someone who has been briefed. Hey, Mom. I was talking to Dad, and he mentioned something about you two maybe doing some financial reorganizing. He said it was just standard stuff, but that you'd been kind of stressed, and he wanted to make sure you were okay. I understood immediately. Gerald had started preparing Deshawn for a version of events, a version in which the coming divorce would be framed as mutual, low conflict, just 2 people reorganizing their lives, and in which Deshawn's loyalties would already be oriented correctly before the full picture emerged. I looked at the wall of my home office. I thought about the $45,000 Gerald had paid toward Deshawn's student loans 2 years ago without telling me. Money from our joint account, dispersed unilaterally, perhaps not coincidentally building a particular kind of goodwill in our son. Deshawn, I said, keeping my voice warm and steady. I'm fine. I'm always fine when I know the truth about something. As for what your father has been telling you, I think when the time comes you should look at everything and form your own opinion. Not his version, not mine. The actual documents. A pause. Mom, is something... I love you, I said. And I'll talk to you soon. I hung up and called Patricia within the minute. He's working the children, I said. We need to accelerate. Agreed, Patricia said. Raymond's report will be finalized by Friday. I'm ready to file as soon as you say go. Friday, I said. We file Friday. File. Raymond's completed report was 63 pages. It was a precise, methodical, and devastating document. Every irregular transaction sourced and traced. Every fraudulent invoice identified and cross-referenced. Every hotel stay, every jewelry purchase, every transfer to Holloway Design Solutions laid out in chronological order with source accounts, amounts, and dates. The total confirmed figure, $387,400 in marital assets diverted for personal use related to Gerald's undisclosed relationship. The business valuation discrepancy. Washington Architecture Group's true value, per Raymond's independent analysis using 3 separate methodologies, was between $2.6 and $3.1 million. Gerald's hired firm had produced a figure of $1.4 million through what Raymond's report described, in careful professional language, as a selection of valuation assumptions not supported by the available financial data, which collectively and systematically produced a below-market result. Raymond had also found something new, a savings account at a separate bank, opened by Gerald in early 2020, into which he had deposited $95,000 in increments over 4 years, categorized in the business books as consulting expenses. The account was in Gerald's name only. I had not known it existed. When I read that page of the report, I thought about March 2020. The pandemic. Gerald working late, taking calls behind a closed door, seeming stressed and distant. And quietly, in the background, opening a bank account I didn't know about. He had started planning while I was home worrying about him. Patricia filed on Friday morning. The filing included the forensic report, documentation of the fraudulent transfers, evidence of the undisclosed equity transfer to Brendan Holloway, the draft will, and Carolyn's written statement confirming that Gerald had asked her to conceal his relationship from me. We also filed a motion to freeze all business accounts and Gerald's personal accounts pending resolution of the asset dispute. Gerald found out at approximately 2 in the afternoon. I know this because at 2:17 p.m. my phone rang. His name on the screen. I let it ring. He called 4 more times over the next 2 hours. I did not answer. I had nothing to say to him on the phone, and anything he said to me on the phone could not be documented the way I needed. At 6:43 p.m., he came home. I was in the kitchen. I heard his key in the lock, heard him come down the hallway, heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. I did not turn around. Dorothy. His voice was different from any voice I had heard from him in 32 years. Stripped of the warmth, stripped of the smoothness, just raw urgency. You need to sit down, Gerald, I said, still not turning around. I made dinner. I don't want dinner. I want to know what you think you're... Sit down. He sat. I put a plate in front of him. Then I sat across from him and folded my hands on the table the way my mother used to fold hers when she was about to say something she had thought through carefully. I know everything, I said. I have known for some time. I did not say anything because I needed to make sure I had everything properly documented before we had this conversation. He stared at me, bit dull. The accounts, I said. The transfers. Holloway Design Solutions. The apartment in Midtown. The will you were having drafted in November of last year. The savings account at First National that I was not a signatory on. I know about all of it. I'm not finished. My voice was level. I am not angry with you tonight, Gerald. I want you to understand that. I am past anger. I am in the part that comes after anger, which is simply doing what needs to be done. He looked at me across the dinner table. The same table where we had eaten 10,000 meals, where our children had done homework, where my mother had once sat and talked about her garden. And I saw something in his face that I recognized from audit meetings when a client finally understood the full extent of what the investigation had uncovered. He looked like a man who understood he had been caught. What do you want? He finally said. What is mine? I said. Everything that is mine, not a negotiated fraction of it, not a settlement designed to minimize my share while you move on with your new life. What is mine? He left that night and didn't come back. 2 days later, Gerald filed for divorce. He filed first. I think he believed that filing first gave him some kind of procedural advantage, that it would put him in a posture of control, that it would set the terms. Patricia had been waiting for exactly this moment. By 4 o'clock on the same afternoon Gerald filed, Patricia submitted our counterfiling, 187 pages, every document organized and indexed, every claim supported by evidence, every number sourced to the forensic report. At 4:52 p.m., she received a call from Stuart Hale, Gerald's attorney. Counselor Okafor, he said, according to Patricia, I think we should talk. Of course, Patricia said. My office, Monday morning, 9 o'clock, and please bring your client. The Monday meeting lasted 2 hours. Gerald looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. He sat next to Stuart Hale in Patricia's conference room, the one with the view of the city, and he did not look at me directly for the first 40 minutes. Stuart Hale presented their opening offer with the practiced neutrality of an attorney who knows the offer is inadequate, but is required to make it. $600,000 cash settlement, proceeds from the sale of the marital home split equally, Gerald retaining ownership of Washington Architecture Group. Patricia waited until he finished. Then she slid a copy of Raymond's report across the table. We have confirmed documentation of $387,400 in fraudulently diverted marital assets, she said. We have an independent valuation placing Washington Architecture Group at $2.6 to $3.1 million, nearly double the figure your client's hired firm produced. We have evidence of unauthorized transfer of equity in a jointly held business. We have a witness confirming deliberate concealment of a significant personal relationship. And we have documentation that your client was preparing a new will. Without his wife's knowledge, that excluded her entirely. She paused. $600,000 is not a serious number given this record, Stuart. We'll see you in court. Stuart looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the table. I looked out the window at the city below. The city I had come to as a young woman with a scholarship and a determination to build something real. And I felt for the first time since the morning I found the ring, completely, entirely sure. We were going to win. And they were only now beginning to understand it. The trial was set for the second week of November. Atlanta in November is the color of amber and rust, the air carrying that particular coolness that feels like a relief after the long southern summer. I noticed it the morning I drove to the courthouse. The light through the trees on Peachtree Road, the smell of something burning somewhere in a good way, like someone's fireplace starting up for the first season. I noticed it because I had made a decision sometime in the weeks before to notice things again, to be present in my own life again. I wore my navy wool coat, the one I had bought in 1989, the year I made senior associate, because I wanted something that communicated that I belonged in serious rooms. It still fit perfectly. Some things you take care of, and they last. Patricia met me in the lobby of the Fulton County Courthouse. She looked at my coat and gave me one brief, approving nod. "Ready?" she said. "I've been ready since June," I said. Gerald and Stuart Hale were already seated when we entered the courtroom. Gerald was in a charcoal suit I recognized. He'd had it since 2018, wore it to important client presentations. He had chosen it deliberately, I understood, the same way I had chosen my navy coat. We were both, in our different ways, trying to walk into this room as the person we believed ourselves to be. The difference was that only one of us had the documents to support that belief. Brendan Holloway was not in the courtroom. He had been subpoenaed and would testify later in the week, but he was not permitted to be present during opening arguments. I had thought about how I would feel seeing him in this setting, and I found that what I felt was less than I expected. Not hatred, not even anger, just a kind of clear-eyed recognition. He was a person who had made choices. So had Gerald. So, for that matter, had I. And I was prepared to account for every one of mine. Judge Beverly Osei entered at 9 o'clock precisely. She was in her early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She moved through the courtroom with the unhurried authority of someone who has presided over enough human difficulty to be neither surprised nor rushed by any of it. I liked her immediately. Stuart Hale gave his opening statement first. He was a skilled attorney. I want to be fair about that. He presented Gerald's narrative with professionalism. A self-made businessman who had built a successful firm through vision and hard work. A wife who had been a supportive partner in the household, but whose professional involvement in the business had been informal and had ended 15 years ago. A divorce that was unfortunate, but in which his client was prepared to be reasonable. He did not mention Brendan Holloway by name in his opening. He did not mention the transfers. He did not mention the draft will. He presented a version of our marriage that was technically composed of true statements and was, in its totality, one of the most complete misrepresentations of reality I had ever heard delivered in a professional setting. I had spent 30 years identifying exactly this kind of presentation in financial documents. Technically accurate, strategically incomplete, designed to create an impression that the underlying data did not support. Then Patricia stood up. She spoke for 18 minutes without notes. "Your Honor, this case is about a specific and documented pattern of financial fraud committed against Dorothy Washington, a woman who co-founded a business, managed it without compensation for 7 years, and spent 32 years building a marital estate now valued at nearly $5 million. The evidence will show that her husband, beginning no later than 2020, engaged in a systematic effort to divert marital assets, conceal a significant personal relationship, suppress the true value of the marital business, and prepare legal documents designed to exclude Mrs. Washington entirely from the estate she helped create. We will demonstrate this through forensic financial analysis, contemporaneous business records, witness testimony, and Mr. Washington's own documents. This is not a dispute about contribution. Mrs. Washington's contribution is documented in extraordinary detail. This is a case about what happens when one party in a marriage decides that the other party's share is inconvenient and tries to make it disappear. She sat down. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Judge Osei looked at her notes, then looked up. "We'll begin with the plaintiff's first witness," she said. "The trial lasted 4 days. I want to tell you about the moments that mattered most because there were several, and each one had a different weight. The first was Raymond Stokes on the stand. Raymond is 64 years old, trim and precise, with the manner of a man who has spent his career making complicated financial information comprehensible to people who need to act on it. He testified for 3 hours. He walked Judge Osei through every finding in his report, slowly, clearly, with exhibits displayed on the courtroom screen so that every number could be seen and followed. When he reached the section on the Midtown apartment, he said, "The lease payments for this property, totaling $74,000 over 22 months, were processed through Washington Architecture Group's operating account and categorized as subcontractor housing, project coordination. There is no project on record that required housing accommodation of this nature or duration." Stuart Hale objected twice during Raymond's testimony. Judge Osei overruled him both times and made a note. When Raymond described the business valuation discrepancy, the $1.4 million figure Gerald's hired firm had produced versus the $2.6 to $3.1 million Raymond's independent analysis found, Judge Osei stopped him. "Mr. Stokes," she said, "in your professional opinion, is the discrepancy between these two valuations explainable by legitimate differences in methodology?" Raymond was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, not hesitating, just being precise. "No, Your Honor. I have reviewed the methodology used by Mr. Washington's hired firm. The assumptions required to produce a $1.4 million figure for this business are not consistent with standard valuation practice and are not supported by the company's actual financial performance. In my opinion, the valuation was structured to produce a predetermined result." Gerald's jaw tightened. I watched it from across the courtroom. The second moment was Gerald on the stand. Stuart had prepared him carefully. Gerald was composed, measured, presenting himself as a reasonable man caught in an unfortunate situation. He acknowledged the relationship with Brendan. He expressed, in the language Stuart had clearly coached him on, that he regretted the pain caused to his family. He maintained that his contributions to the business were primary, and that my role, while appreciated, had been supportive rather than foundational. Then Patricia cross-examined him. She started gently, almost conversationally, asking him to walk through the early years of the firm. "When did you open the business? What was the revenue in year 1? How did you manage the financial operations in those early years?" Gerald answered each question with what he believed was the correct level of confidence. Then Patricia said, "Mr. Washington, I'm showing you Plaintiff's Exhibit 14. This is a letter you wrote to a materials supplier in September 1999. Can you read the signature block at the bottom?" Gerald looked at the document. It says, "Gerald and Dorothy Washington, co-principals, Washington Architecture Group." "Co-principals," Patricia repeated. "Not employee and employer, not owner and helper. Co-principals. That was a courtesy title. We were married. I see. And Exhibit 15, a business proposal submitted to the City of Atlanta for a municipal contract in 2001. Who is listed as the financial officer of the firm?" Gerald looked at the document for a long moment. "Dorothy Washington," he said. "And Exhibit 16, your firm's application for a line of credit with First Georgia Bank in 2003. Who co-signed this application?" "Dorothy Washington. And the bank, in approving that line of credit, would have reviewed both signatories' financial qualifications?" Yes. So the bank considered Mrs. Washington's financial credentials material to approving credit for the business she was, according to your testimony, merely helping out." Stuart objected. Patricia moved on before Judge Osei had fully ruled. "Mr. Washington, when did you first engage an attorney to draft a new will?" A pause. "November 2023. And did you inform your wife that you were revising your estate documents?" "No." "Did you inform her that the revised will remove her name entirely?" "No." "Did you inform her that you intended to leave 40% of the marital estate to your business partner?" "No." "When did you open the savings account at First National Bank that was not disclosed on any joint financial statement?" Gerald's composure fractured slightly, just at the edges, but I saw it. Stuart saw it. Judge Osei, I believe, saw it. "Early 2020, he said. "Did you inform your wife of this account?" "No." "So from early 2020 forward, you were maintaining a secret savings account, conducting a personal relationship using marital business funds, arranging for a new will that excluded your wife, commissioning a valuation of the marital business that you had reason to believe was below market, And you were doing all of this while your wife believed you were building your retirement together. Stewart was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Compound. Argumentative. I'll rephrase, Patricia said smoothly. Mr. Washington, at any point between 2020 and June 2024, did you tell your wife the truth about any of the actions I just described? Gerald looked at his hands on the witness stand railing. No, he said quietly. The courtroom was very still. The third moment, and the one I will remember longest, was Deshawn. My son was not on our witness list. He had been on Gerald's. I had known this and said nothing to Deshawn about it, following Patricia's advice to let him come to his own understanding in his own time. What I did not know, and what Patricia did not know, was what Deshawn had been doing in the 3 weeks since Gerald filed. He had been talking to Imani. He had been going through documents that Imani had quietly, carefully shared with him. Not to persuade him, she told me later, but because she believed her brother deserved to make his decision based on the truth rather than on their father's version of it. Deshawn took the stand as Gerald's witness. Stewart asked him 3 questions establishing his identity and his relationship with his father's business. Then Patricia cross-examined. Mr. Washington, she said, your father contacted you in the weeks after his divorce filing. Did he discuss the case with you? Yes, Deshawn said. His voice was steady. Did he make any representations to you about how a favorable resolution might affect your inheritance? A long pause. Stewart half rose from his chair. Deshawn looked at his father. Gerald was looking back at him with an expression I recognized. The same warm, reassuring expression he had turned on me 10,000 times over 32 years. My son looked away from his father. He looked at Patricia. He told me, Deshawn said, that if things went the way he hoped, I would receive 40% of the estate. He said I should understand that my mother was... that she was being unreasonable, that she was trying to take things that weren't hers. And do you believe that characterization? Another pause. Longer this time. No, Deshawn said. I've looked at the records. I remember my mother working. I remember her at that office when I was a kid. I remember her on the phone with clients. I remember her at the desk. My father keeps saying she wasn't really part of the business. But I was there. I remember what I saw. He didn't look at Gerald again. I looked at my son and felt something move through me that was too large and too complicated to name right there in the courtroom. I held it carefully and set it aside for later, for a quiet evening when I could take it out and feel it properly. For now, there was still work to be done. Brendan Holloway testified on the 3rd day. He was nervous in this way that guilty people are nervous. Not fidgety, but careful. Every word slightly too considered. Patricia was not unkind to him. She established the facts she needed, the timeline of the relationship, the apartment, the LLC, and then she asked him one question that ended his testimony more effectively than any dramatic confrontation could have. She showed him a text message recovered from Gerald's phone records. Mr. Holloway, this is a text message you sent to Mr. Washington on September 14th, 2022. Can you read it for the court? Brendan looked at the document. His face changed. It says, "Thank you for the bracelet, baby. Hope Dorothy doesn't mind you spending company money on me, LOL." Patricia let the silence sit for 5 full seconds. So you were aware, she said, that the funds used to purchase gifts for you came from the marital business. Brendan opened his mouth, closed it. It was a joke. I didn't really think... No further questions, Patricia said. Judge Beverly Osei delivered her ruling on Friday afternoon. The courtroom was full. Imani sat behind me on my left. Deshawn sat behind me on my right. He had moved from the respondent's side of the room that morning without a word to anyone, and no one had tried to stop him. Several of my former colleagues from the accounting firm had come to sit in the gallery, which I had not expected, and which affected me more than I showed. Judge Osei read her ruling from the bench with the same unhurried precision with which she had conducted the entire proceedings. This court has reviewed 4 days of testimony and an extensive evidentiary record. I want to state clearly for the record that this is among the more thoroughly documented cases of marital asset fraud that I have presided over in 25 years on this bench. The credit for that documentation belongs to the plaintiff, whose record-keeping over 32 years of marriage preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost or destroyed. She looked at me briefly over her reading glasses. I met her eyes and held them. The court finds as follows. She found that Washington Architecture Group was marital property. with my contribution as co-founder and 7-year CFO established beyond reasonable dispute by the documentary and testimonial evidence. She accepted Raymond's valuation of $2.8 million as the operative figure, the midpoint of his range. She found that $387,400 in marital assets had been fraudulently diverted and ordered that amount restored to the marital estate for distribution purposes. She found that the Buckhead home, valued at $1.1 million, would be awarded to me in its entirety as partial compensation for Gerald's deliberate concealment of assets and his attempt to remove me from his estate plan without disclosure. She found that Gerald would pay my legal fees in full, Patricia's billing, Raymond's billing, all associated costs. And then she addressed the overall distribution. Total documented marital assets, including the restored diverted funds, amount to approximately $4.9 million. Georgia law provides for equitable distribution, which does not necessarily mean equal distribution. In cases involving deliberate financial fraud, concealment of assets, and systematic efforts to minimize a spouse's share, this court has discretion to adjust the distribution accordingly. She looked at her notes. Then she looked up. The court awards Mrs. Dorothy Washington 70% of the total marital estate, amounting to $3.43 million. Mr. Washington will retain the remaining 30%, from which he will also satisfy the legal fee obligations previously noted. Imani made a sound beside me that she quickly covered with her hand. Deshaun reached forward from the row behind me and put his hand briefly on my shoulder. I sat very still and breathed. "This judgment is effective immediately," Judge Osei said. "Mr. Washington has 90 days to satisfy the monetary obligations. The business will be independently administered during the distribution process, and Mrs. Washington will have the option to take her share as a lump sum buyout or retain an ownership interest at her election." She gathered her papers. "We are adjourned." The gavel came down. In the hallway afterward, while Patricia spoke with her assistant and my children stood nearby talking quietly to each other, Gerald appeared at my side. I had expected this. I had thought about what I would say, and in thinking about it, I had realized that there was very little I needed to say. The courtroom had said most of it. The documents had said all of it. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical appearance. Something had gone out of him, some quality of assurance, of forward motion that I had always associated with Gerald Washington. "Dorothy," he said. I looked at him, the man I had loved for 32 years, the man who had eaten my cooking the night Brendan sat at our table and had thanked me the way he always did. The man who had held my hand in the hospital when Deshaun was born, who had danced with me at Imani's wedding, who had sat beside me at my mother's funeral and said nothing because he had known that nothing was the right thing to say. And also, the man who had opened a secret bank account in the first month of a pandemic while I was at home worried about his safety. The man who had written my name out of his future and said nothing. The man who had tried to leave me with a fraction of what I had spent a lifetime building. Both of those men were Gerald Washington. I understood that now in a way I hadn't fully understood at the beginning of this. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said. "I genuinely do." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. "You were always the smartest person in the room," he said. "I think I forgot that." "I know," I said. "That was your mistake." I turned and walked back toward my children. That was the last conversation I had with Gerald Washington. 6 months later, on a Thursday morning in early May, I sat on the back porch of my house and drank my coffee while the garden did what gardens do in the Atlanta spring, which is to say, it went slightly overboard, everything blooming at once in a way that felt almost argumentative. I had kept the Buckhead house. People asked me if that had been difficult, staying in a house full of shared memories, and I gave them honest answers. Some mornings, yes. Most mornings, no. Because the truth was that this house had been mine before it was ours. I had chosen it. I had cared for it. I had planted the hydrangeas along the back fence and repainted the kitchen the soft yellow that Gerald had always said was too bright and that I had always loved. When Gerald left, the house did not become a monument to grief. It became, more purely than it had been in years, mine. The settlement had been finalized 8 weeks after the ruling. Gerald's attorneys had attempted one last round of negotiation, proposing a structured payout over 5 years. Patricia had responded with a motion to accelerate, citing documented asset dissipation risk. They settled on full payment within 60 days. On a Tuesday afternoon in January, a wire transfer arrived in the account Patricia had established for the purpose. I sat at my desk and looked at the number on the screen for a long time. Then I opened a new spreadsheet and began to plan. From the net proceeds, after taxes and all legal costs, I had $2.9 million to work with. The Baltimore house, my mother's house, the one with the green shutters, received $180,000 in renovations. New roof, updated kitchen, restored hardwood floors. It was now a rental property generating $2,200 per month. Ruth Patterson's life's work, preserved and productive. I thought she would have approved of that. I established a trust for Imani's children, my grandchildren, 4-year-old Marcus and 18-month-old Nadia, funded at $120,000. Money that would be there for education, for opportunity, for whatever they needed to build their own starting point in the world. I donated $100,000 to an organization called Sisters in Finance, which provides financial literacy education and professional mentorship specifically for Black women. I had found them through a former colleague, and when I attended their annual fundraising dinner in February, I sat at a table of women in their 20s and 30s who were learning what my mother had taught me at a kitchen table in Baltimore, that a woman who knows her numbers cannot be surprised. I thought about those women a great deal as I decided what to do with my time. In March, I began teaching a free Saturday morning class at the public library 2 miles from my house. I called it Know Your Numbers. The curriculum covered personal budgeting, retirement account basics, understanding financial documents, and, because I believed it was important enough to say plainly, how to recognize when someone is hiding money from you. The first session had 14 attendees, mostly women between 45 and 70. By the 6th session, I had to reserve a larger room. A woman named Gloria, who was 68 and had recently discovered her late husband's estate was significantly smaller than expected due to undisclosed debts, came every week and brought her sister. "Mrs. Washington," Gloria said to me after one session, lingering while others filed out, "I wish I had known this 30 years ago." "You know it now," I told her. "That's what matters." Deshawn called me on a Sunday evening in April. We had been rebuilding carefully, not quickly but honestly, which I had decided was the only way that mattered. He had seen what he had seen. He had made the choice he made on the stand. We had talked about it once, directly and without drama, and then we had agreed to move forward in the way that practical families do, by showing up consistently and saying true things and letting time do its work. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about something. Tell me. You always said that the most important thing in business is knowing where the money actually is, not where someone tells you it is." "I said that," I confirmed. "I want to take a financial literacy course, a real one. I want to understand what you understand." I looked out the kitchen window at the hydrangeas beginning to come back along the fence. I thought about my mother at her table with her green ledger. I thought about a scholarship and a determined young woman driving to Atlanta in a Honda Accord with $280,000 in savings and a plan. "Come to my class on Saturday," I said. Imani came for dinner the following Friday. We cooked together the way we had when she was growing up. Her handling the vegetables, me handling everything that required a timer. And afterward we sat on the back porch with tea while the evening settled around the neighborhood. "Are you happy, Mom?" she asked. "Actually happy, not managing it happy." I thought about the question seriously, because Imani deserved serious answers. "Yes," I said, "but it's a different kind of happy than I expected to have at 58. It's quieter, less decorated. Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," she said. We sat for a while in comfortable silence. The neighborhood was doing its evening things, a dog somewhere, the sound of a lawnmower finishing up down the street, the smell of someone's dinner coming through an open window. "What about Dad?" Imani asked eventually. She always asked, careful and neutral, because she maintained her relationship with Gerald, and I had told her, meant it completely, that I would never try to interfere with that. "What about him?" "He's in Savannah. Carolyn says he's working as a consultant. It's not going great." I nodded slowly. I had heard similar things through similar channels. The business had struggled after the case. The publicity, the IRS audit that Judge Osie's referral had triggered, the loss of several key clients who did not want their firm associated with the litigation. Gerald had eventually sold his remaining stake at a significant loss. The Brendan relationship had not survived the public exposure of the trial by more than a few months. I thought about how I felt about all of that. What I felt was very little. Not satisfaction, not sorrow, just the recognition that actions produce consequences, and that the consequences had arrived on their natural schedule. "I hope he's okay," I said, and it was true. I genuinely hope he finds something that gives his days meaning. Imani looked at me with the expression she had worn since she was 12 years old when she thought I was being impressively mature about something. "You're really not angry," she said. Not a question. "I was," I said. "Thoroughly and completely and for a while, in private. But you can't build the next part of your life out of anger. You need your hands free." On a Wednesday morning in May, a morning much like the one where I had sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and started reading bank statements, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't open it. Then I did. "Hi, Mrs. Washington. My name is Denise. I was in your Saturday class 3 weeks ago. I've been going through my accounts like you said. I found something. I think my husband has a second account I didn't know about. I don't know what to do. Can I call you?" I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I typed back, "Yes, call me. And Denise, you did the right thing by looking. Now we figure out the next step." I set the phone down on the kitchen table, the same table where all of this had started, the table I had chosen, and that was mine, and finished my coffee. Outside, the hydrangeas were coming in blue this year. My mother had always said blue hydrangeas meant you had the soil chemistry right. I thought she was probably correct about that, as she had been correct about most things. Know your numbers, know your worth, and never ever stop keeping records. They placed their bets on my silence. They forgot that I had spent 30 years learning how to make the numbers speak.